part 2 of the Securing Your Future series. So today we're going to talk about post-marital property 101, claiming your space, exactly knowing how to put things in place, planning, because sometimes we don't plan, and when you don't plan, you prepare for failure. So before we jump into that, I am Keyra Ford, your real estate cheerleader, where I help you take ownership of where you live and how you live, and I help you confidently invest in yourself through real estate. So let's jump back into it. We're gonna have Britney once again, who is going to share her knowledge. Claiming your space and making it your own. So we do have Britney back here talking with us about how to really make sure that you're protecting your future once again. So this is series 2 or part 2 of series of Securing Your Future. So thank you, Britney, again for coming out. She is your family attorney, family law attorney. So if you have any questions about family law, her information will be down below in the description. I don't know if you want to do an intro again. I mean, if you watched the first video, which should be there. But if you didn't, go ahead, Britney. Just give them a quick summary of who you are, where they can find you, and all the things.
Yes, I'm Britney Harrison, and I'm a family law attorney here in Dallas, Texas. I do everything from family formation, adoptions, surrogacies, embryo, all of those things of forming a family through a divorce. We do premarital agreements, cohabitation agreements, post-marital agreements, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, and partition and exchange agreements. So any of your family law needs, we can handle.
Yes, I love it. And she's awesome, guys. Okay, so let's just jump into it. My first question for you is, how does the law view property acquired during, the marriage stage? I know, the video before this that we did, it was talking about before you get married. Now we're married. So how does it view it? Give us the scoop on that.
All right. So you may have heard this before, but Texas is a community property state. And what that means is any property from the moment you're married, any property that's acquired after that date is going to be presumed community property. That means your income, your earnings, if you have a separate property house, that when you rent it out, the rental income, all of that's considered community property. And so if someone acquires property, regardless of whose name it's in during the marriage, it is going to be presumed community property. So even if you, let's say you all decide to purchase a house from Keyra and only one person's credit is, acceptable for the loan and things like that, if you do it during the marriage, it's going to be presumed community property. And that means that on divorce, it could go to either party. And so even if your name's not on the deed during marriage, it's still going to be presumed community property. And now we can talk a little bit more about how to protect that in a bit.
Okay, so that is so good. Before we even move on, so they buy a house through me. They are married, but one person is buying the house. The other person is not. They don't even have to be on the deed. If they got a divorce, it could potentially not even be the person who actually bought the house. It could be split as if they bought it together, correct?
Correct, because it's a community property state. And so that's something where you have to definitely be careful, because if you have a spouse that is wanting to use funds that they owned prior to marriage, and then they want to buy this house during marriage, you have to be very careful with how that deed is titled and tracing those funds from the proceeds. Let's say they sold their premarital house, they sold it and then want to buy a new house for them to live in as a married couple. Well, those proceeds from that sale of that first house, if they put those into the purchase of the new house, you've now got what we've got called a mixed character asset, because presumably you're going to have some community by, getting a mortgage to go with it, plus the down payment. So if you want to protect that, you have to make sure that deed shows what percentage of this is going to be separate property. That's not something people like to do. It's hard to do with title companies, all those things. It's confusing. I know I get confused by it. I'm sure you probably get confused by it. So you have to be very careful with combining separate property into community property, because once you have the two mixed together, it's commingled. And unless you can go back and trace it by showing the transactions, like the bank statements, check stubs, all of that kind of stuff, it's going to be presumed community property. And so you've got to be really careful if you want to keep it separate. Make sure it says it on the deed.
Exactly, because that's what I was going to ask next is how can you separate the two? What are the issues that typically come up when you're trying to mix the two, community property and separate property. So what you're basically saying is just make sure you put it on the title, make sure that it is very clearly where it's sourced from, because if not, you kind of could be in a world of
You're going to be
trouble.
dealing with that presumption of community property, and then it's divisible between the two spouses. So the best way to protect against that is to have a premarital agreement. But now we're in a marriage. If you didn't have a premarital agreement, there are some legal mechanisms that are still out there that can help you protect that property. First would be potentially a post-marital agreement. So a post-marital agreement, sometimes you hear it as a post-nup. Easier way to think of it is just an agreement that's similar to a prenup, but you're doing it as spouses. With that post-marital agreement, you can decide what property is going to be separate, what property is going to be community. Additionally, you can have what's called a partition and exchange agreement, which takes community property and kind of separates it and says, you know what, this was community property, but now we're going to say this is spouse one's separate property and this is spouse two's separate property. So a lot of times we might combine the two documents, but it's essentially saying, okay, we have this pot of property. How do we want to say what's separate and what's community? We just partition the community and turn it to separate. And then we also list it's like, okay, so from here on out, this house or this particular piece of property will be spouse A's separate property. This piece of property will be spouse B's property. And that way you're kind of go ahead and figuring out, how are we going to divide this? If for some reason we end up getting a divorce, this takes care of all of that kind of, questions about, okay, who's getting what and all that type of stuff. You can partition and exchange the income. And you can also say these liabilities are going to go to this spouse. These liabilities are going to go to that spouse. But on that's a whole other video because, especially with credit cards, like credit card debt, that's between you and the credit card company who's going to be on the hook for that. You can only do so much in a divorce. So you just have to be really careful with how things are titled and making sure it's very clear of who's going to be getting what in the event of a separation.
And, we're not here promoting divorce. We're not here saying like, get a
I'm
divorce.
getting married. No, we're not doing any of that.
You get married in September. Yay, right? September or is it October?
September.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so we're here to help you, plan. Because I think when you fail to plan, you prepare for failure is what they say. Was that the quote? Something around that.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And so I just want you guys to, have the right information to take the right steps. So if it's getting that prenup, if it's doing that is it post-nup?
You can call it post-nup, post-marital agreement. They're all basically the same thing.
Yes. And so when you have a plan, we're saying we're not planning to get a divorce, but we're planning just in case anything actually happened to us so that we would know what needs to go where. So that leads me to my next question for you is, okay, so you talked about documents. What are some legal documents that can protect you after being married or when you get a divorce?
So from that, one of the first things I always have my clients, once we have the signed divorce decree, I always encourage them to make an appointment with an estate planning attorney, because now you've got all of this property, and hopefully everything was taken care of during the divorce, that where now things are moved into your name, like the house is titled in your name, things like that. Or if you got a name change, making sure the deed reflects your new name change, but kind of making sure all those are there. You also want to make sure you go to an estate planner, because your estate planning might have already changed, or if you didn't have it beforehand, you now need it because you're no longer married and you have to figure out what's going to happen to my things if something were to happen to me. And so that's what the estate planning attorney can really talk about and make sure that you're planning for those, particularly if you have children. Or for me, I don't have children. So if I didn't have an estate plan, the laws under the Texas estate code may not be what I want. I want my things to go to my nephew because I'm that aunt. I need to make sure my nephew's good. And so an estate plan is the only way that I can ensure that happens. And so it's also good to do it while it's fresh on your mind. You just finished the divorce, go ahead and do it at that moment. So you can just ensure that all the assets are taken care of, because you got everything in your divorce decree. Take that to your estate planner. And it's these are my assets. This is what I want to do. Let's get a plan in place.
Okay, guys, I know that they are giving you so much value, but before we go on, make sure you comment below something. I want you to say, ask a question, something so it is getting more engagement. So I am able to skyrocket on these platforms. And not only that, if you have any additional questions about real estate, I want to be your real estate cheerleader. Schedule a strategy session so I can help you get you to where you are to where you want to be. All right, let's get back to it. Yes. And unfortunately, we don't have Antoinette today, but we will have her on the next one that talks a little bit more in depth about estate planning. And so that is good because you gotta, I mean, it's fresh. Go ahead and get someone to document. Guys, we have to prepare for our future. We have to secure our future. And the reason why, you know, when deaths happen or divorce happens and we don't know what to do, it's because we didn't think that far ahead. Not saying that we're hoping for divorce or death or anything to that extent, but, you know, you just got to be prepared. That's it. That's all I can stress is be prepared.
Absolutely.
But then that also leads me to my last question, which is, you know, how can individuals like balance like the desire of maintaining like individual ownership of their assets, but also like still, you know, nurturing and maintaining this relationship that they have without like stepping on each other's toes. It's something that you said in the first series, which was like, you know, this isn't romanticized, but like, how do they maintain that?
Yeah. So with any relationship, it's best to communication. That's the first part is communication is key, and just making sure going into that marriage that you know what's important to you. And you also know what's important to your spouse. Finances. I think I mentioned this before. That's one of the main causes or one of the main problems with divorce is that people not being on the same page about their finances. Well, having these agreements in place, it kind of takes that part out of the equation. So now you know, okay, well, here's what the finances are. These are kind of the rules for it. And it's there, it's done. There's nothing to fight about at that point because it's already written down. And so get that out of the way and just treat it like insurance. Again, it's like pet insurance, health insurance, car insurance. You have it. You don't always need it, but you have it. And so that's what I tell my clients. Like after we do a prenup signing, I'm like, okay, well, come in here. Let me see the dress. I want to see the pictures from the weddings. We do the little post-marital signing afterwards. And it's like, here's your decree, or excuse me, here's your prenup. Go throw it in a drawer and then you never have to worry about it. Just go live your lives according to what your plan is because you've already talked about it. But yeah, it is a fine line, but it's at the end of the day, it's all about communication.
Yes. And you're right. Communication is key, but also comprehension. So that's also another way to make sure that you and your partner are on the same page. Y'all have the same desires because you don't want to find out 10 years down the road that maybe we should have done this.
Exactly.
I guess I said that was my last question. I do have one more question, which is like, what is post? Does it have to be immediately after they get married, or could it be like years into the marriage?
It can be years into the marriage. Like I've had some cases where, they were married 20, 30 years and then they decided rather than get divorced, they just wanted to do a post-marital agreement. So that can be done. Generally, whenever I do a prenup, in the prenup, it has a provision in there that says that they have to come back within 30 days of their marriage to ratify the prenup. And that's simply because there's some protections available to spouses in the Texas Family Code that's not technically available to non-spouses. So we still put all that stuff in the premarital agreement, but we have them come back as spouses and sign it. So that way it's kind of like a little belt and suspenders type, ensuring it's all protected. And so that's just kind of the thing. But generally on a normal basis, anytime after marriage.
I love that. This is so good. All this value. I mean, guys, if you would like for us to do a seminar or webinar going a little bit deeper, answering any specific questions that you may have, comment below saying seminar, something, so that we can set that up, because my mission is to always bring you guys so much value and help you take ownership of where you live and how you live. And so I just want to say thank you again, Britney, for jumping on the series and, spreading your knowledge. And like I said, her information is below. So if you want to do a prenup, if you have cohabitation agreement that you want to do, if you're getting divorced, unfortunately, but I mean, she's still a divorce attorney, adoption. I actually have a really good friend I want to connect you with who is in the process of getting, is becoming, becoming a mother and adopting. So guys, you have the resources, use them. So thank you so much. And we'll see you next time, guys.
Oh my gosh, there she is. It's Keyra Ford. Keyra Ford. You don't know what? Never heard? Oh my gosh, she slays every time.